All right. Hello, folks, and welcome. We still have people coming in, um, but we're gonna get started because it's 4:01. Um, Thank you for joining us. This is the Building a Culture of Peace Forum, which is a special project of New Hampshire Peace Action Education Fund. It's a steering committee and some of the members are not yet here, but Alyssa Barr is on that steering committee. I am on that steering committee. L.R. Berger, Scott Dickman, and Whitney Howarth. Um, and we try to do 4 or 5 programs a year. And this is our third special Corona online presentation. We usually do this program at the Unitarian Church in Concord. Very excited to have Michael McPhearson for Racism in the War Machine. We're going to talk about what's going on in our country right now and how it relates to the peace movement. This is, for those of you who are averse to having your image online, we are currently live streaming onto Facebook and YouTube. And it will be recorded in both places so that folks who couldn't be with us right now are able to watch this down the road. So Michael is a very exciting speaker from my perspective. When I got started at Peace Action about 11 years ago, I think Michael at that point had just moved to be the coordinator, the national coordinator of United for Peace and Justice, which was was at that time the umbrella group that coordinated all the different peace groups. So, somebody who I have always looked at as a famous peacenik. I also knew at that point that Michael had served as executive director of Vets for Peace for about 5 years, from 2005 to 2010. Back in 2010, I joined the board of directors of Veterans for Peace, and we went through a little bit of a shaky time. We had to make some staff changes, and Michael came back in as a board member to help us. Michael's other things that he has done include being a founding co-chair of the Don't Shoot Coalition, which was founded in the aftermath of Michael Brown Jr.'s murder. And then he led Vets for Peace again as executive director from 2013 to 2019. So he's got about 11 years leading that organization. He's also done work with a number of other organizations around the country. And as a member of Vets for Peace, it was really interesting for me to watch when Vets for Peace shifted in the wake of Michael Brown to focusing on Black lives. There was a lot of pushback. People who said, we work on anti-war work, and this is not, this isn't war. This is something else, and it's not wrong to care about it, but this isn't what our organization is supposed to do. And that was kind of jarring to me, because I identify as a member of Vets for Peace and as a veteran for peace, and I don't frequently think we need to have much of a separation between organized mass murder overseas and our willingness to allow murder inside the borders of our country. And I think that the things that drive and let us be complicit in this violence are a lot of the same things. And so I don't see much of a membrane between war and peace. Racism and war and peace as issues. I think that they're very much extensions of the same idea, and so that in addition to who Michael was and has been during my term as a peace activist, is something that makes me very excited to be able to host him today. And I'm gonna, as I finish introducing Michael, I want to tell a little story about in a board meeting. when Michael and I were both board members of Vets for Peace, and we were talking about, and these board meetings were often very packed. They were multiple days, and we were talking about the need for us to have concrete campaign plans. And I believe that we were talking about the 10-year anniversary of the Afghanistan war at this point, and knowing that to do the kind of campaign work we wanted to do was going to take a long time, and we didn't have that kind of time in the board meeting. Our chair, Elliot Adams, who was a Vietnam vet, a paratrooper, asked Michael if he would lead us through this section. And in about 12 minutes, Michael explained the basic theory of Alinsky style organizing, goals first campaigns, walked us through what a campaign might look like in Afghanistan, got feedback from board members, and essentially had a concrete campaign that Veterans for Peace could execute. And it really was under 15 minutes. And I was sitting there and I was just kind of in awe of what had just transpired. And I said, when I grow up, I want to be just like Michael McPhearson. And Elliot Adams looked across the table and said, yeah, me too. And and so I'm going to turn it over to Michael and just say, Michael, I'm so grateful to have you here with us today. So grateful to hear from you about what's been going on around the country, how it relates to peace, and how you see us being helpful, how you see it all fitting together. So take it away.
Wow. Well, thank you for that introduction, Will. And I can't say I remember that story too, honestly. And I'm sure it was more than 15 minutes, but I really appreciate it. And I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about these issues. And I hope that what I share with you gives you food for thought to be able to address the challenges that we have and the fact that we're all trying to work for peace. And as the forum is about building a culture of peace, I believe that's exactly what we do have to do in order for us to save ourselves from ourselves, to be honest with you. So now I'm going to do a PowerPoint. So you got to excuse me as I try to make sure I set this up right and all that. So let me, okay. Yeah, so I need to share my screen. And share, I'll put my screen for video. Share. And let's see, slideshow. Yay. Looks like I got part of it. Okay. Well, I can't see you all anymore, so I'll just go ahead and get started. So I like to start my talk, and it's going to take, actually the talk's more than about racism and the war machine. It's really about the triple evils, because I was led to the triple evils as part of this, as I did my research and figured out what I wanted to talk about. And, you know, the triple evils Dr. King talked about in his speech, Beyond Vietnam, on April 4th, 1967. So I'd like to start my talk about racism and war by first briefly talking about war itself. And I'm gonna have some videos. This is gonna take a bit of time, and I have some videos, so I won't be talking the whole time. There'll be videos as well. As peacemakers and justice seekers, to abolish war, we must think deeply about what drives humans to war. I think we must ask ourselves, what are the fundamental reasons humans participate in war? Is it a choice, or is it inevitable? Is peace possible? And we need to ask ourselves, do we even believe in peace? Do you believe peace is possible? I do a number of talks, as you can imagine, and I've asked peace activists, do you believe peace is possible? And I was really surprised to have really not, I mean, I'm not going to say not that many people raised their hand, but everybody didn't raise their hand. And more times than not, it was less than 50% of the audience in peace activist circles who did not raise their hand. And I think that's important, because if we don't believe peace is possible, we can't be our authentic selves when we're out talking about peace and asking people to work for peace. So if you aren't sure if peace is possible, I would suggest that you do whatever you need to do to read and really come to a place where you believe peace is possible, because that's when you can do your best work. But what is the purpose of war? What does it accomplish? What is the utilitarian value of war? And now up here, you see on the screen from the Art of War, the purpose of war is to obtain peace and peace to prepare for war. I think that's a dark vision of peace. So I don't really go with that, but I understand what he's saying. But let's look at someone else's thoughts about that. So von Klutzritz, he's a Prussian general and military theorist. He wrote a book on war that was published. It took him many, many, many years to write this book. And he was impacted by the Napoleonic Wars and Frederick the Great of Prussia. The book was published after his death. He died in 1831. It was published in 1832. And people today, military strategists and theorists, still use his book to talk about war. And as you can see, he says war is a continuation of politics carried on by other means. So in other words, it means war is a means to force one's will on another. And as you know, basically the United States, if you don't do what we want, we'll go to war with you to force you to do what we want. So we ask ourselves, what are the causes of war? And I found this list online. You know, this is obviously not the definitive list of what might cause war. I think it's as good as any list. So you can read it. I won't read it. I will just say that perhaps these things cause wars, but they certainly are, at least they are motivators for it. And for the people who direct the wars, the people who send people to war, you know, economic gain, territorial gain, those can be the things that are the political reasons they want to go to war, but they're not necessarily the reasons that the masses or the soldiers were fighting the war. So in their book, their 2008 book, Sex and War, how biology explains warfare and terrorism and offers a path to a safer world, Malcolm Potts and Tom Hayden argue there is a strong evolutionary biological reason we go to war. Among many important ideas for us to think about, they remind us that war is primarily a male behavior. So this is the part of the quote that I'm going to read that I wanted you all to see. But there's a little bit before it. So the evolutionary perspective we take here highlights the fact that team aggression is predominantly an activity of young males. And although it affects women, it very often does not benefit them in a lasting way, as we will show. Women compete for resources for themselves and their offspring, and may even benefit from association with the most aggressive, successful male leaders of the group. But their competition is not usually expressed with such violent destructiveness as among men. There are women gangsters, warriors, and terrorists, of course, just as there have been great female military leaders. But despite some fanciful misinterpretations of prehistory and anthropology, women have never shared men's propensity to band together spontaneously and sally forth to viciously attack their neighbors. Now, we know this is true in our own history. In the U.S., our history is replete with examples of white men banding together to viciously attack their Black neighbors. And we can see it for ourselves in the past and present, in the wars, not just our wars, but other wars. Though aided by women, men by far seek, plan, and conduct war. So this leads me to believe patriarchy is a major cause of war. And I think as peacemakers and justice seekers, we need to think deeply about that. So as I said, reading and thinking about racism and war led me back to Dr. King and the triple evils. I don't see how we can look at two and leave out the third evil, poverty and capitalism, or capitalism, depends on how you want to look at that. With that said, I do not believe capitalism or racism causes war, but racism and capitalism are pillars of U.S. war making. And racism plays a specific role in enabling U.S. wars. Now, we know neither racism or capitalism are the cause of war because war existed before the concept of race and the emergence of capitalism. According to a website called Ancient History Encyclopedia, The simple bow was in use in Mesopotamia as early as 10,000 BCE, and cemeteries from northern Mesopotamia to Egypt attest to early warfare on a fairly significant scale. The first war in recorded history took place in Mesopotamia in circa 2700 BC between Sumer and Elam. So the point is that war is ancient, and capitalism and race, as we think of it today, simply did not exist, but yet those wars took place for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So to understand the role of race and racism in war, which is what we're talking about, I think we must acknowledge a fundamental ingredient of war. And this ingredient, no matter the reasons and causes for the war, one ingredient must be present or the war simply isn't possible. Here you see a quote from Dr. Simon Anglom, I think that's how you say his name, a teaching fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London, from his co-authored book, Fighting Techniques of the Ancient World. And he says, war grows naturally out of the tribal mentality. A tribe is a society tracing its origin back to a single ancestor who may be a real person, a mythological or a mythical hero, or even a god. They usually view outsiders as dangerous and conflict against them as normal. So from my perspective, race is more of an enabler of US wars than a cause. No matter the reason, again, for the war, one ingredient must be present or the war is not possible. And that ingredient is dehumanization and the creation of the other. You must have that because humans really don't like to kill each other. Yes, mobs form and they might take some lives in that passion. But even when they take those lives, the lives they take are people that they don't see as being like themselves, that they have already dehumanized and think of as the other. That's the reason they formed, was to go out and go after those people that they see that way. And armies are sustained and trained, and that takes motivation. And yes, we know that the poverty draft, economic reasons can get a person to join the military. But in order for that person to do the killing, when the killing starts, they have to see the enemy as the other. So race and white supremacy are the primary means to dehumanize the enemy to enable US wars today. So at this point, give me a moment because I want to show you a video. Hopefully I'll be able to do it. Okay.
Racism in foreign policy and racism at home were born together. They're twinned from day one. White settler colonialism against the Native Americans and white supremacy in the internal structuring of the country, especially relative to blacks and originally slavery. And the two went very much hand in hand. So on one hand, white supremacy at home structured a huge part of how the United States functions internally, it's the most fundamental problem in American democracy and in American class relations, both. And it's the fact that it's both that gives it its potency, and that it's so powerful from the beginning of the country. And at the same time, those who founded white supremacy at home were practicing white settler colonialism and genocide against Native Americans. So the two went hand in hand and is fairly blurry. It's like it's the same thing. It's white supremacy practiced at home and abroad. And you may be for it, or you may be against it, but whichever side you're on, it has a lot to do with whether your attitude towards white supremacy. Right. So, the so white settler colonialism is practiced against the Native Americans sets the tone for American foreign policy from the very beginning, dominates American foreign policy for the first 100 years, and sets the whole basis of how they organized, conceptualized, and organized the military,
Right.
And how they conceptualized and organized settlements. And and it extended to taking over more than half the territory of Mexico, and then to attempts to take over Cuba and Puerto Rico and other parts of the Caribbean, Hawaii, the Philippines. So white supremacy is a fundamental premise, as well as rationale, as well as practice of foreign policy. So to me, the two are absolutely twinned.
From 1899 to 1905 and 1910, in which anywhere from 500,000 to 2 million Filipinos were wiped out. It was a genocidal war. And so for the United States, there were different kinds of foreign policies. And one of the things that is misunderstood.
When you say there were different kinds, what do you mean by that?
Well, that's what I'm going to get to.
Oh, sorry.
That there were foreign policies for what we would now call the global South, and there was foreign policy for Europe.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So, and this is where people sometimes get confused by the notion of isolationism. Mm-hmm. So you hear about after World War I, there was a period of isolationism. And, there was the America First movement, right? Well, it's really a misnomer to call it isolationism. What it was much like with Trump, there was a reaction against international treaties and obligations. And particularly in the case of Europe, as we went from 1919 towards the beginning of World War II, there was a strong anti-Semitic current in the United States, and there was a softcore fascist movement that did not see Germany and Italy as a particular threat. But Michael, it wasn't isolationist, because at the same time that this was going on, there were countless interventions by the United States overseas. In the period after World War I ended, you had U.S. interventions in Haiti, which was in 1915, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, in China, obviously the issue of the Philippines, the U.S. occupation of Puerto Rico. The list goes on and on. So there was no isolationism. There was this idea that the United States should be able to do whatever it wanted, particularly in the global South. And even in the lead up to World War II, the America First movement was particularly focused on Europe and the U.S. staying out of the European conflict. So you had this situation where there were these sort of dual foreign policies, mm-hmm. and race was very central mm-hmm. in this entire period.
But the context, it's easy to look back and like, oh, Jeff, you're an idiot. But I was 17 or 18. I went to high school. I learned history, which ended at World War II.
Right.
Right. And I had no reason or to question any kind of foreign policy or look at the U.S. special role in the world in any kind of critical way at all. It just never occurred to me, I guess.
Right.
So
well, that changed, didn't it? So So I guess that goes to the question, tell us about your Gulf War resistance, because it apparently at some point you did start to question and put some things together.
Sure. I joined 86. I signed up for 4 years. I did 4 years. And in those 4 years, as I stationed in Okinawa and the Philippines, South Korea, the DMZ, I just became disillusioned with what I saw. I really saw us as protectors of democracy, and in fact, I saw us as being abusive towards our quote-unquote hosts. I felt uneasy, when people used very derogatory terms to the Japanese people and the Filipino people and the Koreans, and it didn't sit well with me, I guess. And then I realized I didn't really want to kill people either. At the rifle range, sure, I could shoot things, but there was always this thing, obviously, in the Marine Corps, right? You're singing about, murdering and killing.
And I deployed to the Middle East in March of 2003, first to Jordan and then to Iraq in April of that same year. The beginning of my friction with the chain of command in my unit began before we actually deployed to the Middle East, when I made the decision that as an infantry squad leader, I was no longer going to physically punish the men under my command, and that I would no longer yell at them, but that I would instead establish a relationship based on respect. And that didn't sit too well with my platoon leader or my platoon sergeant at the time, because they felt like an infantry leader has to inject high levels of testosterone into his leadership style, and that in order to get your men to follow you and to respect you, you have to lower them to the level of your boots and humiliate them. And I started by saying that because I want people to know that the dehumanization and the disrespect and the humiliation that we're bestowing upon the people of Iraq does not begin in Iraq. It's not the result. It's not the result of people waking up one morning as monsters, but it's part of the culture. It's part of the military culture. They train us that way, and given the environment that we find ourselves in, all kinds of things that under normal circumstances would seem impermissible and objectionable become basically the norm.
During both tours of Iraq, there was an obvious and intentional dehumanization of the Iraqis, especially during the first deployment. I don't know how many times I heard Iraqis referred to anything other than Hajis. And this term was used by the entire chain of command and was used with our training. And I think the use of the terminology proved effective in dehumanizing them, because we were just so disrespectful. If just patrolling down the streets, if anyone got too close to our formation, we would use that as an excuse to mess them up. The logic behind this was possibly, he could be carrying a bomb, which has happened in the past, but anyone who turned the corner and ended up within our reach suffered consequences.
We were told we were fighting terrorists. The real terrorist was me, and the real terrorism is this occupation. Racism within the military has long been an important tool to justify the destruction and occupation of another country. It has long been used to justify the killing, subjugation, and torture of another people. Racism is a vital weapon employed by this government. It is a more important weapon than a rifle, a tank, a bomber, or a battleship is more destructive than an artillery shell or a bunker buster or a Tomahawk missile. While all those weapons are created and owned by this government, they are harmless without people willing to use them. Those who send us to war do not have to pull a trigger or lob a mortar round. They do not have to fight the war, they merely have to sell the war. They need a public who is willing to send their soldiers into harm's way. And they need soldiers who are willing to kill and be killed without question. They can spend millions on a single bomb, but that bomb only becomes a weapon when the ranks in the military are willing to follow orders to use it. They can send every last soldier anywhere on earth, but there will only be a war if soldiers are willing to fight. And the ruling class, the billionaires who profit from human suffering, who care only about expanding their wealth, controlling the world economy, understand that their power lies only in their ability to convince us that war, oppression, and exploitation is in our interest. They understand that their wealth is dependent on their ability to convince the working class to die to control the market of another country. And convincing us to kill and die is based on their ability to make us think that we are somehow superior. Soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen have nothing to gain from this occupation. The vast majority of people living in the US have nothing to gain from this occupation. In fact, not only do we have nothing to gain, but we suffer more because of it. We lose limbs, endure trauma, and give our lives. Our families have to watch flag-draped coffins lowered into the earth. Millions in this country without health care, jobs, or access to education must watch this government squander over $450 million a day on this occupation. Poor and working people in this country are sent to kill poor and working people in another country to make the rich richer. And without racism, soldiers would realize that they have more in common with the Iraqi people than they do with the billionaires who send us to war.
Okay, sorry. These video clips illustrate that racism and white supremacy are at the core of U.S. foreign policy. They also show how racism is used to dehumanize the enemy and rationalize U.S. wars. As Camilo said, it doesn't start, when we go to war. It starts here at home, and it doesn't start in the military. It starts when you're a kid. Understanding the role of white supremacy is critical. Anti-Blackness is the cornerstone of white supremacy, but the concept of racism as we practice it is based on a hierarchy where white people are at the top and Black people are at the bottom. Everyone else is somewhere in between. So once in Western history, religion was the main enabler of war. It was how the leaders who had their own individual political reasons for war motivated the masses to fight. Catholics against Protestants, the crusade to take back Christian sites from Muslim hands. But with the rise of science and diminished influence of religion, another enabler was erected to rationalize many things, not just war, but many things. I participated in a webinar titled Be a Middle Class Trader, sponsored by the Highlander Center. That's the storied institution attended by Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and many others. The presenters talked about the advent of class societies about 10,000 years ago or so, with patriarchy as the first class system. So we still obviously live in a class system, but today our class system is held together by racism, making it a racialized capitalism that rationalizes who is and is not deserving of self-determination and resources based on race. Those resources could be who should get healthcare, of course, who should get a job. It's pervasive throughout our society. Black people are animals. They do not have the right to control their own bodies. So we had slavery. Europeans viewed indigenous people around the world as savages. So they did not have the right to control the land they lived on. They don't know how to develop it. So we have manifest destiny and colonization. White Christian capitalism and democracy are the animating tools of war today, but foremost is white supremacy, which includes a Eurocentric view of the world. They are the dehumanizing tools, the one spark you must have to wage war. And you know this, the US was founded with racism deeply planted in our national character. It is embedded in our founding documents with the Constitution counting enslaved people as 3/5 a person. Two major foreign policy decisions that began before the Republic was founded were to take indigenous land and import enslaved Africans to the US to work the stolen land. In both cases, dehumanization using the tribal mentality of race was the enabler. To motivate soldiers to kill another human, we must make the enemy less than human and beyond redemption. The enemy must not deserve to live. They must be outside of our tribe. The dehumanization begins here at home with how Black and brown people are seen and treated in our society. Racism here at home makes it easier to convince the public that the enemy is dangerous and something unlike us. They are the other. And it makes it easier because if you have Black and brown people here in the US that you demonize and make them the other, and those people, you know, I speak English just like everybody else, most people who live here. The dominant religious belief here is Christian. I'm a Christian. I go to the same stores, you know. I watch the same TV shows, listen to the same music. So we have all the same cultural touchstones, generally speaking, between the so-called races, the different colors of people. But yet somehow I'm dangerous. I'm the other. And if you can do that to me, then how much easier is it to do it to people who don't speak our same language, who eat different foods, who have a different religion, but are brown and Black people? And it's interesting when we think of terrorism, who comes to mind? As if there aren't such thing as European terrorism or domestic white terrorists, but they've planted in our heads to think of dark-skinned people. One only need to look at the list of armed conflicts. Well, what I meant to say, this is not an opinion. One only needs to look at a list of armed conflicts involving the US, and you will find that the enabler and the vast majority of them are racial. Or what I should say is white supremacy has been the greatest motivating force in US armed conflict since before and after our founding. Again, it is not the lone motivator. Demonizing communists to rationalize conflict with European powers and white people is done as well. But nothing comes close to the use of white supremacy to rationalize why it is okay to kill people. The fear of Muslims is coupled with the fear of dark skin to rationalize the global war on terror and minimize domestic terrorism. And if you think back to Bill Fletcher, he talked about two foreign policies. One for those who are like us in Europe, and another one for the people in the global South who are not like us. And racism, as I said, and a Eurocentric way of seeing things is crucial to being able to do that. So what do we do about it? Because it's nice to have this information and begin to understand and peel away the importance of racism when it comes to US foreign policy and US wars. But what do we do about it? As primarily white organizers, which it appears to me that that's what we have here today, you should listen to people of color and follow the lead organizations in your community to confront systemic racism and white supremacy in your cities and towns. And I think the anti-war movement must become more of a peace movement by working in concert with issues that challenge and defeat racism and rapid capitalism. We have to find ways to do parallel work or work in concert with that kind of work. And I say the anti-war movement, which is a little bit to me different than a peace movement. When Will talked about the pushback we got around Ferguson, and I was telling my son about it, who's also a veteran, and the first thing that came out of his mouth is, I thought you all were veterans for peace. So, you know, right off the bat, he was thinking, how could it be that people are pushing back on you when you're supposed to be for peace? But I believe the most important step you should take is to confront your own white supremacist tendencies. And men of all colors must confront their patriarchal ways. I, for one, believe that war is most driven by patriarchy. So I have another clip to show you, and that'll be the end of the clips. Just 1 second. Again, share. Okay.
You say that all whites are racist. Can you expound on that, please?
Any white person who was born, raised, and schooled in the United States of America, if you aren't a racist, you're a miracle. Either that or you decided to educate yourself. Because education in this country is about white is right, brown's all right, black's got to stand back. Yellow's mellow, but whites, we educate in a way that says that white males have done all the adventures, have made all the adventures, have done all the discovering, have made all, everything that is good and has been accomplished according to social studies, which is actually anti-social studies, by white males. It's a lie. But we do that in order to maintain the myth of white superiority. The myth of race has to be maintained at all costs in this country. Because if white people have to give up the color of their skin as being something that makes them perfect, what do they have left?
That's sadly not true. In her 2018 book, White Fragility, D'Angelo digs into unconscious biases and why white people are so defensive when it comes to talking about race.
So what's white fragility? That's the title of your book, is White Fragility. And the subtitle is why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism. Why white fragility, and how do we recognize it?
You know, the fragility part is meant to capture how little it takes to set white people off, to set us off into defensiveness. So for many white people, the mere suggestion that white has meaning will cause us to erupt in defensiveness. For many of your listeners, the fact that I'm generalizing right now about white people will set off the defensiveness. Individualism is a really precious ideology for white people, and we do not like to be generalized about. My response to that is, I'm a sociologist. I'm quite comfortable generalizing about groups of people. Social life is observable and describable in patterned ways. And yes, I'm an individual. I'm also a member of a social group. I have to be willing to grapple with the collective messages we're all receiving because we live in a shared culture.
So one of the things that I think some people might experience as deeply provocative is when you say that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. How so?
Well, white progressives are my specialty because I am a huge white progressive. And what I mean by that is not so much Democrat, Republican. Any white person who sees themselves as not racist, less racist, who's thinking right now of all the other white people that they wish were listening to this program right now because they really need it, that is a white progressive. And I think we do the most daily harm because we're more likely to be in the lives of people of color. And yet our identities are very much rooted in this idea of ourselves being free of racism. And so if racism comes up, we're going to put all of our energy into making sure you see us as free of racism, and really rarely any of our energy into what we need to be doing for the rest of our lives. It certainly includes people who have conscious intent of harm, but most bias is actually not conscious. So we have to change our understanding of racism from an individual moment that may or may not have occurred to the system we're in and that is circulating 24/7, 365. And that changes the question from is or isn't he or she racist to how is racism manifesting in this context?
The second guidance I would offer my fellow white people is to change what you understand it means to be racist. The mainstream teaches us that a racist is an individual who consciously doesn't like people based on race, apparently has to be conscious in order to count, and intentionally seeks to be mean to them. Also apparently needs to be intentional in order to count. So individual, conscious malintent across race. And I don't know that you could have come up with a more effective way to protect the system of racism. Because if that's what I think it means to be racist, and you suggest that anything I've said or done is racially problematic, that I'm making an assumption that comes from a racist framework, much less that I benefit and collude with the system of racism just by being white, what I'm going to hear you saying is that I am a morally wrong and bad person. And now I'm going to have to defend my moral character. I think that simplistic definition of what it means to be racist is the root of virtually all white defensiveness on this topic. And
I got it on Kindle.
Ah, okay.
I don't know if you saw this. It went viral online. A flight attendant was greeting people on her plane, and some gentleman came on and he was reading your book. It opened up a whole conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because it actually illustrates several really important points about this. I mean, on the one hand, the story was special because a Black woman and a white man had engaged conversation. He talked to her with humility and openness, and that was exceptional. But let's just notice that would be exceptional. You know, there's a question I often ask when I'm in front of a mixed race group. And I ask the Black people in the room a kind of rhetorical question. How often have you attempted to give a white person feedback on their inevitable and often unaware racist assumptions or behaviors and had that go well for you? Never. Number two, response, rarely. And I'll never forget asking a group, okay, so what if you could just give us feedback on our inevitable and often unaware racist assumptions and behaviors? And I'll never forget this Black man raising his hand and saying, it would be revolutionary. And you know, just take that in. I just want all the white people to just take that in. Revolutionary, that we would receive the feedback with grace, reflect, and seek to change our behavior. That's how difficult we are.
Wow.
That's how big a-holes we are.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you know, that's not a very tall order. Really? That's a revolution? But we can't get there from the current paradigm that says only mean people who want to hurt others based on race ever could do so. So we just have to change what we understand it means to perpetrate racism.
Yeah, and well, the term white.
Go again. Okay. So I wanted to show those clips because building a culture of peace means that we have to figure out how to come together as different groups of people and learn how to talk to each other. And I know over the years, been involved in the peace movement for some time now. For example, United for Peace and Justice, before, when I first got involved in the peace movement or anti-war movement, people would say, why aren't there more people of color at this meeting? And I would ask, well, how many people of color do you really know? Do you hang out with? Do you have relationships with? Because then instead of coming to a meeting and wondering where they are, they might be coming to the meeting with you, you know, because you have relationships. So question, why are there so few people of color in the peace movement? Well, there are two reasons I'm going to speak for Black people, or not all Black people, but my observations. Black people do not see their interests reflected in the peace movement or the anti-war movement. As a result, activists who are warriors, because the activists for people of color, activists in general are kind of warrior. But I would say for people of color, because we're navigating white supremacy every day, we're defending our communities. And if we don't see how working in a particular space is going to defend our community, we can't take the time to spend in that space because our communities are under attack in terms of just having food or having a job or, you know, having a place to live, or just living, you know, which is what the movement for Black Lives is all about. So it's kind of ridiculous to expect people who are dealing with those types of in-your-face challenges to join with something that is not clear how that's going to help. And we know it's not clear because the Vietnam War has been over quite some time, and it didn't change poverty, nor did it change the situation for Black people. One of the reasons they feel this way, I think, goes back to the clips I just showed you, where people feel like white activists are not fully confronting their white supremacy tendencies. And examples are, as Robin DiAngelo said, and you should think about this yourself, how many times have you really had a unguarded, real serious discussion about how you as a white person, or if you're a man on this, listening to this or watching this presentation with a woman, have you had a discussion about how you're impacting them as a man, or you impacting that person of color as a white person personally? Or has a person of color ever came to you and said, hey, you're doing something I think, might be a little racist, or, I didn't really appreciate it, and you just accepted it? Or if you got upset, went back and had a discussion with them about it. You must be able to have these conversations. You must be able to pull the veil of denial off of your eyes. And I say that for me as a man. So it's not just about, I'm not trying to preach to people. I'm also trying to practice this myself. So I say this to all men of color, all men of all colors is what I meant to say. Patriarchy is the mainstay oppression from which all things spring. I really believe that. So like white people confronting white supremacy, men must confront male supremacy. So if we confront our own bias and mechanisms of supremacy and dehumanization, we will see the world in new ways and can address issues we face with new ideas and in stronger coalitions. You'll all of a sudden understand things that you didn't understand before and have new ideas about how to go at things. I believe we need a full spectrum movement for peace and justice. And I think we can have it if we realize the answer is within us. We are the only ones standing in our way. So that's the end of my presentation. And now I'm up for questions, or if it's been too long, I guess we can just stop.
So I would encourage folks, thank you so much, Michael.
Sure.
I would encourage folks to either raise your hand virtually or post in the chat. I'm happy to read questions off in the chat. The same goes if you are watching on Facebook or YouTube. Post your questions there and I'll read them off. Or if you're here, you can raise your hand virtually. We may or may not see you in time, so don't be afraid to post in the chat that you'd like to be unmuted to read a question. And not seeing anything quite yet. I'm gonna just elbow in as host and get my question in. Can you talk a little bit about what you see happening in Kenosha and this most recent flare-up of police violence against people of color and the fallout from that, and give us a little bit of just your thoughts on where we go from here. How do we we thought we had a turning point and a moment that we could build from over the last couple months, and where do we go right now, and what are you seeing around what's going on in Kenosha?
Yeah, tell me, when you say we thought we had a turning point, what was that turning point?
I thought that the killing a few weeks ago was something that, or I guess it's almost 2 months ago now, that
you talking about George Floyd?
Yeah, I'm talking about George Floyd. Thank you. I couldn't recall the name right now, but I thought George Floyd was a moment that was bringing this to a head, where we were going to have some conversations. There was going to have to be some legislation, and there were going to have to be real changes made before we could move forward. And it just kind of a couple months of gentle calming, and then we had Kenosha a few weeks ago, and that shooting, and it's something that made me, I would have thought that for what it's worth, that police would have been conscious enough to not do that right now, that there would be some sort of like, okay, we need to be really careful until we've come to grips. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say there. I thought something was going to change,
right?
And then Kenosha happened, and I want to know how you're feeling and thinking around that.
Yeah, I understand now. So George Floyd, I believe, is a moment, and it wasn't George Floyd death that was the moment. It was reaction to it, because there have been many deaths. My personal moment was Amadou Diallo, which was 20-something years ago now, I guess, like 22. And all my life, like my first experience thinking of the police in a negative way was when I was a little kid in North Carolina, Fayetteville, North Carolina, at my grandmother's house. And one day she said something like, "The bull is outside," or something like that. So I'm running to the door expecting to see a bull, out in the street. We didn't live in a rural area. It was a town. So I was going to be like, wow, there's a bull outside. And I look outside and there's a police car. So a bull is not something that, is a cuddly animal that, you pet and think of in a necessarily a positive way. That's something you should be scared of. So my grandmother, planted that idea in my mind. Clearly, she saw the police as something to be scared of. So we're talking at least 50 years later. I'm 56, so let's just say I was 6, but I think I was younger than that I've had these messages, but they're not messages that are just put in the Black community because we're trying to scare ourselves. They're put there because of our experiences. So I said all that to say that over the past 50 years, there's been all kinds of deaths. Another time was Rodney King, which I think I was coming back from the Persian Gulf when that happened, or I had just gotten back. So this would be 30 years ago, the beginning of next year, when Rodney King happened. And here we are still 30 years later, dealing with the exact same issues. Rodney King should have been, right, a turning point. But I do think it is in that with George Floyd, in that so many people, similar to with Michael Brown with the Ferguson uprising, millions of people around the country, diverse groups of people came out. And I saw something that I hadn't seen before, but, history is long. So my little, at the time, 50 years didn't really mean that much, but it looked different. And this time it's even larger and bigger and more sustained in many ways, because it was sustained in Ferguson, but not everywhere to the degree it was there. But this is everywhere. So I do think we're having this discussion now, right? But it doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take people continuing to push. And unfortunately, if we're honest about it, change doesn't happen unless there is friction, unless there is, I don't want to say unless there's violence, but it seems that that's the case, because it's not as if people of color and Black people in particular have not been talking about police brutality forever. And it's not as if the police keep saying they're going to change or deny it. But nothing happens. So nothing happened. And then Ferguson happened and we started to see some change, but look what it took in order for that change to happen. The little that did. And now we have George Floyd, and all of a sudden, like someone said, it's like people are discovering that racism really exists. Everybody except Black people, we were clear on that. But thank goodness people are discovering it in a different way. So it takes this type of agitation. It takes disruption. If we don't want to say violence, we have to say it takes disruption. So I do think I think there is a change. To what degree, I don't know. Also, I fear that, like in the past, and we can see that with, there's this idea of the third reconstruction, which means a third addressing of what America should be, right? Well, that means that there were two others. So maybe this is the third, and then people will lose interest. And by that, I mean white people, because they lost interest after the second one, the civil rights movement. Will they lose interest or think everything's okay? And the racism will find other ways to express itself. That could happen, but hopefully that means a progression. And as far as between George Floyd and what happened in Wisconsin, this is part of the spectrum of what it's going to take for a change to take place. And when you have someone in office, and when I say office, the only nationally elected office, whose intent is to separate us, as opposed to all the other presidents, however they might have used racism, because the Republican Party certainly does use it. The reason that it's been overwhelmed by racist tendency people and people whose ideology is based on racism is because those people are always there and not only allowed to be there, but were kind of stoked to speak up to because that's what parties do, right? They find constituencies. And then the Democrats use it in a way to keep Black people with them. But all the presidents I've ever seen, and you can't say that all the presidents, there's some racist presidents before this one, right? So I'm not saying that, but the ones that have been around since I've been around have at least tried to have some semblance of unity, and at least some idea of forming the perfect union, right? This one does not. So he has, I guess you could say, inflamed, or you all know this, he's just gotten people to where they think they can do things. But in a way, it's good because it makes us have to deal with it. It makes us, we have to deal with it. And people have to decide, where am I? Maybe I'm not, maybe I am a little racist, but I'm definitely not like those people. And I don't want this country to be like those people. So I'm willing to do something different to make a change, right? So I think we're in that process and we have to see where it goes. And I would say to white people, you are the key, because Black people cannot change white people. We've been trying. Basically, we're just navigating your world. And we're leveraging power where we can. But generally speaking, we don't have power. We don't create the institutions. Some of us have infiltrated in. You have like Barack Obama's become president. Great. So that shows that there's been greater change. But the institutions are still run by white people. And they were built on racism. And it still is an intricate part of the systems. And until white people are ready, and men are ready to change, because patriarchy even more so, until men are ready to make a change and struggle with each other, it's gonna stay similar. So it's up to you all. Because we're going to agitate because we don't have any choice. But the question is, how do white people react to the agitation?
Thanks. So I think I'll read off questions if they're posted. I know it looks like Whitney wants to make her own question, but the first question in the chat is from Jessica, who is back in New Hampshire, my wife, Jessica.
Hey, Jessica.
And it's, can you talk about your personal strategies that you found helpful for recognizing and addressing your own oppressive tendencies?
Sure. I think one of the biggest is to listen when people challenge me on something I've done, and try to disconnect as as Robin DiAngelo was saying, disconnect this idea that because I've done something means I'm a bad person. No, if I don't do anything about what I've done, that's where I'm a bad person. And not to say I could be fragile. Male fragility is real, right? So I've had situations where I did something and it brought tears to my eyes because I was thinking about myself and the disappointment, the profound disappointment I was having with me. And that's tough, because you got to get over that. But I find strength in knowing that the challenge is, what do I do next? And also, I don't know, just reading. One of the times that I came to, I guess, somewhat of an epiphany for me was I was reading a textbook, a women's studies textbook, and it talked about women being afraid to go out at night. Now, that might not be exactly how they put it, but I started thinking about that. What is a basic freedom? A basic freedom is freedom to move around. That's just a basic thing. And when I started to think about that and try to put myself in a situation where, as a man, and I'm not going to say all men are this way and all women aren't that way, so that's not okay. But generally speaking, I'll walk to the store at night or go for a run or do whatever I want, unless it's like a real scary neighborhood somewhere, maybe I wouldn't. But a lot of women, if they go do it, they think about it once or twice, or they don't do it at all. And that really kind of like hit me really hard, because the privilege of that's a profound privilege, that as a man, I feel like I can walk around wherever the hell I want to. Now, as a Black man, it becomes a different question, right? But I still have more freedom in a different kind of way than women do. And I have to be clear on that as a man. So reading and trying to see yourself as best as we can, because we can't do that as men. But to the extent that we can, really letting ourselves be vulnerable, and think about the privileges we have, because they're profound, they're deep, the privileges we have as men. And then when you're around other men, just notice how we're talking, the things that we say. And you got to figure out ways to challenge men. And I'm not saying the men do that all the time, because people are not going to want you around sometimes if you do it all the time. But you do have to figure out ways, and it's a skill that you gain over time. And sometimes you just might have to lose a friend or two, because some things that some of us say and do just are not acceptable. So.
Thanks. I'm gonna let Whitney ask her own question. So Whitney Howarth, are you there?
I am. Thank you.
All right, go for it.
Hi, Whitney.
Hi, Michael. It makes me think your answer to Jess's question. Maybe we should talk about the quadruple evils: patriarchy, racism, militarism, and capitalism.
Right.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm on the board of the Building a Culture of Peace, and I'm just so grateful for this lesson and this message. I was particularly struck as a professor of history, talking about the white supremacy at home and abroad in our settler colonialism and manifest destiny policies of the past, and also of how we have been imperial. And so what I'm noticing in the last few months, and what's really disturbing to me, is that we're starting to use military hardware. It was always disturbing to me that we're using it on the border to keep out the unwanted enemy at the gates, and how we're militarizing ICE, and how we're funding, this sort of brutal war machine to keep the enemy out. But what's really been interesting and horrifying to me is that we're using that military hardware and even ICE troops to put down the rioting, to discipline the people within the democracy who are speaking up, who are agitating, who are disrupting. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how disturbing that is to you, or how we respond to ICE being used against rioters, against protesters, and if that's been a disturbing trend for you as well.
Sure. I guess, thank you for the question. I guess the first time, I don't know, because the peace movement, we've seen a lot of different things used against us over the years. But I think I will say that it became more visible to the public, I think, during Ferguson. I think that's when people really started to see the MRAPs, and they had been used because people have used them to do all kinds of raids. And it's interesting because it's similar tactics that are used overseas, no knock, bust in on people, are used here with similar equipment. So yes, it's disturbing, but not surprising. The government has been selling, nearly giving away this equipment to local police departments for the last, I guess, 17, 20 years or so, whenever the program started. So it's definitely been over a decade. And again, I'm going to use men, but this could be anybody. If you get a toy, but guys like to go to the Lowe's or Home Depot and get a power tool, and we're going to find something to use it on. We might use it one time for something specific, but then after that, what are we going to use it for? We're going to find something. So it's not surprising that if the police departments get this equipment, it's not going to just sit there, right? They're training on it. As a soldier, it wasn't like I wanted to go kill anybody, but I've been training for 3 years. So now is the opportunity to go to war. Let's do it. I'm ready for it. So yeah, so it's not surprising. And as far as a response, the response has to be, we don't stop. We keep on and we find different tactics to disrupt, because the power structure, and this would be any power structure throughout history, it is going to try to maintain itself in any way that it can, right? So we have to push back on that, and we have to talk to people. We have to educate people so that the people who aren't in the street are on our side. And then that can help, that will change, I think, how the government reacts. But if the people who aren't in the street aren't on our side, then it gives the government more leeway to do whatever it wants to us. And don't forget, there has been reaction in the past where in Newark, during the Newark rebellions, many people were killed by the National Guard. So it's not, and Kent State happened where a few people were killed, and Jackson State happened. So it's not out of the imagination that, and that was when we had an elected official who wasn't, first reaction to everything is to try to be super dude, testosterone guy, right? Now we do. So this is a dangerous time. But it's the time we have to have. That's the thing, I think, that we shouldn't be sad. We should be taking action. And in some ways, I'm not saying we shouldn't be glad, but I'm not saying that we should be glad. I'm not saying that, but we should be enthusiastic, because that means that is opportunity for the change that we need. Things are so broken. Some people, when people say it's not broken, this is how the system was created. And so it's bringing out the things. There's people who say that, right? And that's true. There's truth to that, but it's broken for us, right? And in order to fix it or to change it, it's going to take friction. It's going to take something, right? So this is our opportunity to make the kind of change we're looking for. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. That actually plays out really nicely into the next question, just from Jacqueline Jill Rito, and it's a very broad question that I'm sure you could do its own 90-minute presentation on. But the question is, what role does nonviolence play in the dynamics of our current political situation?
Well, first of all, there's always going to be people who are going to do violence. There's never in short supply. So at a minimum, being nonviolent and being an example of nonviolence and being an example of what a world can look like provides an alternative to those voices and to that way of being in the world. So that to me is of the utmost importance, because as I said, there's going to be people who are going to be violent. So the question always has to be, well, who is the person who is going to be nonviolent? Who is the person who is calling for an end to the violence and actually working to bring the violence to an end? The other thing is, I think most Americans across the spectrum really don't want to see the country descend into, just violence, I don't think, right? People who profoundly disagree with me on a lot still don't want to see that. So there's a small group of people, really, who want to use violence and want to see violence. So the more that we, as peacemakers and justice seekers, can come up with nonviolent ways to address issues and to illustrate things and to touch people, because people are touched through narratives, they're touched through things that they see. I believe the quicker we can get to a place where we'll find the changes that we want. And again, there's plenty of people who do violence. And as I said in the presentation, war and violence can become its own thing, and then it takes time for that energy that it creates to be spent. But during that time period, the more people who are still being nonviolent, the more people who are showing examples of nonviolence and where we want to actually be, it can sap energy from the violence. But the more people who are violent, the more energy, the violence gets, and it takes longer time for it to spend itself. And eventually it does, because people get tired. They just get tired and they don't want to see any more death. And in war, one side eventually loses. It doesn't have enough people to throw into the war machine anymore, and it loses. So eventually it happens. The challenge for us is to try to siphon off that energy or stop the energy before it gets to that terrible place. But it can get there. We need to understand that can happen. We don't want that.
Thanks. That's it's a really great response to a question that I felt like could be a book. I appreciate that you were able to wrap it up in that nice tight package. Next question from Kelly Denton Borhog, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing names there. You say that race is an, quote, enabler of war, whereas dehumanization is the central necessity / cause of war. But if racism and patriarchy are fundamental roots of dehumanization, then don't they play a causal role in war?
Sure. I mean, when I was writing it, I was thinking about, well, how you use this word versus that word and trying to define, and it gets kind of like splitting hairs. So yeah, to a certain degree, you're correct. The reason that I tried to explain somewhat of a difference is because it's like when I hear capitalism is the cause of war all the time. And you could say that for capitalism. Well, if we got rid of capitalism and we went to something else, if we're not really dealing with, because like I said, capitalism wasn't around and there were still wars, then there's still going to be a war. So that's the reason that I'm talking about dehumanization, and that racism is that tool to dehumanize. So it's dehumanization appears to me to be the thing, because let's take racism out of the equation, because once there was no such thing, as I said, at least in the way we think of it, there was some kind of tribalism, the creation of the other, that tendency humans have. And so that's why I say that. So that's kind of like from a theoretical space, but also so that when we're building things and talking about things, we're clear on what we actually need to address, you know, instead of addressing something that, oh, once we get rid of it, oh my God, we still got wars. Why is that? Oh, it's because it actually is dehumanization, and they found something else to use to dehumanize, you know? So that's why we have to really deal with that. Now, will we see that in our lifetime? If we did, that means we did a hell of a job changing it from racism to whatever that next thing is. So I don't necessarily expect that. But our movements build on each other. I stand on the shoulders of people from 100 years ago, 150 years ago, right? So people are going to stand on our shoulders, and we need to be providing them, like Frederick Douglass talks about, gosh, I had it and then I lost it, but no change happens without a demand. I'll just put it like that, right? Okay, yes, he's right. And I have that, and I understand that, right? Dr. King talked about the triple evils. Now I have that. So what are we saying today that we're giving to the people who come after us, you know, that they can use to continue to build? So this is the reason that I talk about it like that.
Thank you. The next question is from Arnie Alpert. He says, Michael, how does, and I know you're in Seattle now, but you were in St. Louis and Ferguson for a while. So the question is, how does the trajectory of change look in Ferguson and St. Louis in the years since Michael Brown was killed?
Yeah, that's, I think the trajectory of change is that there have been some newly elected politicians, for example, who are really trying to make the kind of changes. And I'm not talking about the mayor, I'm talking about prosecutors, African-American, who are trying to make the kind of change that probably would not have happened. I know that there's some young activists who have gone on to do things that if they hadn't been radicalized by Ferguson, they would not be doing. I know that there's addressing of cash bond that's happened across the country as a result of Ferguson. I know that the kind of pushback that I received in VFP during Ferguson is not happening now. And one of the reasons I think, and that's, I think, across the country amongst many organizations, is because Ferguson kind of plowed up the soil and planted some seeds that are sprouting now, you know, so because change, some people have to be introduced to things a little slower than others. It takes them a little while to figure out some things. Ferguson provided that spark so that more people could rise up this time. So definitely from my perspective, Ferguson was key to what we see today. And Trayvon Martin's death helped build what happened in Ferguson. The Black Lives Matter was coined as a result of Trayvon Martin's death. Ferguson helped to make it more popularized. And since it was popularized by Ferguson, and we can look at, gosh, his name just escaped me, Colin Kaepernick, right? Kneeling as a result of what happened in Ferguson. And now we have all kinds of athletes standing up in ways that they would not have done then and would not have done if Colin Kaepernick hadn't shown them a path. You know, so we do see an arc of change that's come from that rebellion. And I call them rebellions, not riots.
All right, so the last question we've got in the chat is from Barbara Slivers. And it's, along with introspection on my own racial beliefs and time in prayer, what can I do to end racism? And thank you for a wonderful, meaningful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. You know, it's hard for me to tell you what you individually can do other than look around yourself and think about how racism is playing out from you and around you, and deal with that, whatever that is. And if that means you need to go participate in some anti-bias, anti-racist trainings, where white people get together and learn skills and learn just how much baggage you actually carry. And I participated in those kind of trainings that challenged me with my own baggage. And when I worked for NCCJ, there was something that we did called Anytown, which is supposed to be Anytown America. And we brought young people together of various backgrounds, color-wise, economic status, etc. And we went through a series of exercises, experiential exercises. And they reveal a lot about yourself. And, we go through a debrief. And that's one of the ways that I was able to learn about my own baggage. The knapsack that I can't remember, the woman came up with a knapsack of white privilege. Well, I have a knapsack too. I have a knapsack of male privilege. I have a knapsack of being a US citizen. I have a knapsack of being a Christian, at least those three. I have a knapsack of having gone to college, have an education. There's privilege that goes with that, so being able to recognize these things, you probably do need to go to something to help peel all that for you. And then you have to be brave, and you have to take those chances. And what's the worst thing that can happen to you? That's one of the things we really tried to help people see, that the worst thing that can happen to you is that you'll feel bad, but more than likely nothing else is going to happen. It's funny how fear makes us not do things. But you just have to be brave, and then the difference, you can't make a difference in that way, especially around you. That's where it really starts, right? Around you. And then as you start to do that, you'll figure out other things, I think.
Thank you, Michael. And we are out of time. There's one question in the Facebook that maybe you can address really quickly, and that it's from Chris Marion. He says, today being Fred Hampton's birthday, and in the wake of his Rainbow Coalition, how do you see a new cross-group and cross-movement coalition coming together to fight for change?
Wow, I didn't know. Well, someone wrote Peggy McIntosh, and that is the person that came up with Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Thank you, Whitney. I didn't know it was Fred Hampton's birthday. Fred Hampton is kind of role model hero for me, in that he did have a vision to bring people, really the Poor People's Campaign vision, to bring people together. And he was doing it in Chicago. And I believe that he was a Black Panther. And, people talk about the Black Panthers, many people anyway, as if they wouldn't do something like what Fred was doing, which was bringing people, white people, Native Americans, various people together. But one thing I just want to say is that the Black experience in the United States on whole has been about everybody. We have not been a people who have only been about ourselves. Of course, there's people within us that are feeling that way and acting in that way, and that's fine, but generally speaking, if we weren't that way, we would have had an armed resistance of Black people, and we really haven't had that. Any kind of armed resistance that's been from us has been defensive. There hasn't been actual, we need to get away from you and we're going to use arms to do that. Our approach generally has been, things need to change and we're going to make you change, and we'll defend ourselves. So I said that just because I think people need to think about what Black people are doing in this country when it comes to trying to make this country better. Key, I think, to the kind of change we want is some kind of rainbow coalition. That's why I spoke about this full spectrum movement, where we're working together to make the full spectrum change, so nobody's left behind, which is what Fred Hampton was trying to do. And there's this video of the end of a meeting where Fred would say, Black power to Black people, and everybody in the room of all colors would say black power to black people. And then he said white power to white people. And they all said white power to white people, you know, and he would go on. That's a hell of a thing to understand that our liberation is all bound together, and that I want you to have power as a white person. That doesn't mean that takes power from me, and you want me to have power as a black person. That doesn't mean it takes power from you. That's what he was cultivating, and that's why they killed him, because that's scary to the system. The system is able to stay in place because we are fractured, because we haven't figured out and realized that we have more power than it has when we're together. And once we really figure that, the more we figure that out, the more powerful we become. So I'm all for that. But again, it's going to take self-reflection by people who do hold some power. So again, men. And if men are dealing with men across our ethnic backgrounds and stuff like that, that would make a huge difference. And white people dealing with each other, that would go a long way in building this rainbow coalition, I think, that we need to have.
Thank you so much, Michael. We've got to close, unfortunately. And I want to remind people, tomorrow night, 7 p.m., we're going to be talking about the Just Schools movement. So join us here on NH Peace Action Live on Facebook, or if you don't have your link for that and you want to be involved in the conversation, please email Doreen at NH Peace Action. We do every other Monday 1-hour tight conversations, and sporadically we'll have these Sunday afternoon building a culture of peace conversations, and those will continue. So keep your eyes open for them. Michael, thank you for your mind. Thank you for your heart. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your preparation. So moving to have you here and to hear your words tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you, and power to the peaceful. All right.